The smell of her perfume was still in the hallway when I came downstairs at 6 in the morning. She hadn't been home since Thursday. It was Saturday now, and the scent, something warm and slightly woody, the one she'd started wearing about a year ago and that I had never entirely learned to associate with her the way you associate a scent with someone you know completely, hung in the air near the coat rack like a question that had been left open. I stood at the bottom of the stairs in the gray early light and breathed it in and then walked past it to the kitchen to make coffee. My name is Owen. I was 44 years old, a civil engineer for a regional infrastructure firm that spent most of its time thinking about bridges and drainage systems and the invisible load-bearing architecture of things people used without noticing. I had been married to Melissa for 6 years. We lived in a house in Cedarbrook, Indiana that we bought together 2 years into the marriage, a 1940s colonial on a quiet street with a front porch that neither of us used as much as we'd imagined we would when we signed the papers. Dara, my daughter from my first marriage, was 16 and lived with us full-time. Her mother had moved to Portland 4 years ago, a decision that had been mutual and painful and was now simply the background geography of Dara's life, managed with the logistical care of two people who had made peace with what they'd built and then unmade. Melissa and Dara had always had a complicated warmth. Not hostile, never hostile. But with the specific texture of two people who needed each other in ways neither had fully admitted and communicated it poorly. Thursday had started as an argument and ended as a departure. The argument itself was not unusual by the standards of the past year. We'd been cycling through the same territory for months, the same grievances finding new language each time, the same silences afterward that lasted longer than they used to. What was unusual was the way Melissa ended it. She'd said, with a flatness that was worse than anger, that she was going to Connor's. Connor. Her ex-boyfriend from before we met. A name that had surfaced perhaps twice in 6 years of marriage, always in the neutral past tense of a relationship that was over and unremarkable. He lived 40 minutes away in Millhaven, where he ran a landscaping business and had, as far as I knew, no ongoing connection to Melissa beyond the occasional social media acknowledgement. I had stood in the kitchen and said, very evenly, "Okay." She had looked at me for a moment. I think she expected something else, some escalation that would give the departure more weight, and then she picked up her overnight bag, which I noticed she had already packed, and she walked out. I hadn't called. She hadn't texted. And now it was Saturday morning and her perfume was in the hallway and her car was not in the driveway and the coffee machine was making the sounds it always made and Dara was still asleep upstairs. I poured the coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the window where the morning light was coming in at a low angle across the counter, the way it did in October, the way I had always found quietly satisfying in the years before satisfaction started requiring effort. And I thought about the overnight bag. The one she had packed before the argument finished. 6 years of marriage accumulates a specific kind of shared knowledge, not the declarative, conscious knowledge of facts and preferences, but something more textural. The way another person occupies a house. The particular rhythm of their moods across a week. The small calibrations of daily life that you perform automatically without ever having agreed to them. Melissa was an event planner, corporate functions, galas, the elaborate logistical theater of occasions that required months of invisible preparation to appear effortless. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things that match their fundamental nature. She had a high tolerance for competing demands, a talent for managing other people's expectations, and the particular composure of someone who could hold a dozen moving pieces in mind simultaneously without visibly straining. Those same qualities made her, in certain moments, difficult to read. The changes over the past year had been subtle enough that I had spent considerable time questioning whether they were changes at all or simply my own perception shifting under the pressure of the accumulated friction between us. That uncertainty had been its own problem, a kind of epistemic fog that made it impossible to act on what I was seeing because I couldn't trust what I was seeing. The phone had been the earliest and clearest signal, though I hadn't named it that at the time. Melissa had always been attached to her phone in the way that her profession required. Constant availability, rapid response, the perpetual readiness of someone whose clients could need her at any moment. What changed was not the frequency of the phone but the angle of it. The small, practiced rotation away from shared sight lines. The bathroom trips with the phone when the phone had never previously been a bathroom accessory. Looking back at those early months, the phone angle was the thing I should have named out loud rather than filing as professional habit. I told myself that event planners needed privacy for client communications. That was true enough to serve as cover, which is exactly what made it effective. Connor's name had surfaced in April, the first time in years. Melissa mentioned, over dinner, that she'd run into him at a trade supplier they apparently shared in common. She said it with the ease of information being offered rather than concealed, which I had taken as evidence of its innocence. I said something neutral and she said something about how he was doing well with the business and the conversation moved on. I had thought nothing of it. I thought about it considerably more, later. The distance between us had been growing in the way that distances grow in marriages, incrementally, without a single identifiable moment, through the accumulation of conversations that ended too quickly and evenings spent in parallel rather than together. I had attributed it to stress. Her business had expanded that year, 2 new corporate clients requiring more travel, more evening events. I had been patient with the absence because I believed in the explanation. Dara had noticed before I had. She mentioned in July, while we were driving to her soccer practice, that Melissa seemed distracted lately. She said it carefully, the way teenagers say things they suspect might be more loaded than they're presenting. I told her that Melissa had a lot on her plate professionally. Dara looked out the passenger window and said, "Sure." That single syllable carried more information than she probably intended. Ray, my closest colleague, an older structural engineer who'd been with the firm for 20 years and had the particular perceptiveness of someone who'd seen everything at least twice, commented in August that I seemed preoccupied. I told him the Millhaven Bridge assessment was taking more of my concentration than expected. He accepted that with the skepticism of a man who knew the difference between project stress and personal stress and was choosing not to press. The argument in September, 3 weeks before the Thursday departure, was the first one where I felt something shift permanently. Not in the content of it, which was the familiar circuit of our disagreements, but in Melissa's effect during it. There was a quality of impatience in her that was new, not the impatience of frustration but of someone who has already arrived at a decision and finds the current conversation irrelevant to it. She ended the argument not by resolving anything but by simply stopping. The way you stop a process you've determined is no longer worth running. I had noticed that and hadn't known what to do with the noticing. And then there was the overnight bag. Already packed when the argument was still ongoing. I turned that detail over in my mind on Saturday morning, drinking coffee in the October light, understanding that you don't pack a bag as a response to an argument. You pack a bag in anticipation of one. I called Phoebe on Saturday afternoon. My sister was 3 years younger than me and had known Melissa for the full 6 years of the marriage, known her in the complicated, layered way that in-laws sometimes develop genuine affection that is also partly loyalty audit. Phoebe had always liked Melissa. What she said when I called told me she was in the process of revising that. "I've been waiting for you to call," she said. Which was not the opening of someone with nothing to report. She told me carefully, choosing words with the precision of someone who understood that what she said could not be unsaid, that she had seen Melissa at a restaurant in Millhaven 3 weeks ago. A Saturday afternoon. Phoebe had been there for a friend's birthday lunch and had spotted Melissa at a corner table with a man she didn't recognize but who matched, when I described him, a general picture of Connor. 3 weeks ago. The week before the September argument that had felt like an ending before the ending. I sat with that for a long time after the call. That was the moment the fog lifted. Not all at once, but enough to see the shape of what I'd been standing inside. The September argument hadn't been the cause of something. It had been the symptom of something that had already been decided, in a restaurant in Millhaven on a Saturday afternoon, while I was probably home with Dara watching whatever sport was on. I didn't call Melissa. I had made that decision on Thursday evening and I was holding to it, not out of pride, exactly, but out of the understanding that whatever was happening needed to reach its own conclusion without my interference. Calling would have given her something to respond to. The silence gave her only herself. Dara came downstairs Saturday afternoon and found me at the kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold. She looked at the table, at me, at the empty chair across from me that Melissa usually occupied. "She's still not back," Dara said. "Not a question." "No." She sat down without being asked. She was 16 and carried herself with the specific composure of a teenager who had already navigated more adult complexity than most adults were comfortable acknowledging. She looked at me directly in the way she had that I always found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. "I found something in June," she said. "In the car. I wasn't looking for it, I was getting my soccer bag from the back seat and her phone was on the seat and a message came through. I didn't read it. But I saw the name." I looked at her. "Connor," she said. "June." For months of knowing something I didn't know, at 16, and carrying it alone because she didn't know what to do with it and had decided, with the instinct of someone protecting a parent they loved, not to be the one to deliver it. Even now, thinking about what that must have cost her, for months of sitting with a piece of information that was too big for her and too small to act on, I feel something that has no clean name. She had been trying to protect me. She had also, in her own 16-year-old way, been hoping she was wrong. I told her she should have said something, and then I told her immediately that I understood why she hadn't, and both things were true simultaneously. She made us dinner that evening, pasta, the simple kind, the way I'd taught her years ago. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about her school and her soccer and the friend who was having a difficult semester, and the conversation had the particular quality of two people choosing to be present with each other in a moment that required it. I was grateful for her in a way that was hard to express and probably didn't need expressing. Ray called Sunday morning. He had heard something. Cedarbrook was not large, and the social circles that intersected around the firms and families of a mid-sized Midwestern town were smaller than they appeared. He had heard, from someone whose name he declined to share, that Melissa had been seen in Millhaven that weekend. He asked, without asking, whether I was okay. I told him I was managing. "Owen," he said. "What are you going to do?" "Wait," I said. "And see what she does when she comes back." There was a pause. "And if she doesn't come back?" I looked out the kitchen window at the October morning. The front porch. The empty driveway. "Then that's an answer too," I said. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do in those 2 days. I didn't go through Melissa's things. I didn't access her accounts. I didn't drive to Millhaven or ask anyone to investigate anything. What I did was think, systematically, the way I thought through structural problems at work, tracing load paths and failure points and the places where stress accumulated invisibly until something gave. The picture that assembled itself was not comfortable and was not ambiguous. Connor had re-entered Melissa's life sometime in late spring. The trade supplier encounter in April was either the beginning or the cover story for a beginning that had already occurred. By June, Dara had seen his name on Melissa's phone. By the Saturday in September when Phoebe saw them in Millhaven, whatever was happening had been ongoing long enough to feel comfortable: the corner table, the unhurried afternoon, the body language of two people who were not meeting in secret because they were past the stage of meetings feeling like secrets. The overnight bag was the final piece of the picture. Packed before the argument. Which meant the argument had not produced the departure had been planned, and the argument had been the available vehicle for executing it. She had needed a reason to leave that felt reactive rather than premeditated, and our recurring disagreements had provided one. I sat with the completed picture and tried to locate, inside it, the thing that hurt most. It wasn't the betrayal in the abstract. It was the architecture of it, the sustained, deliberate construction of a parallel situation over months, maintained carefully, protected by the particular composure that was Melissa's professional gift and, I understood now, had also been her personal cover. I had admired her composure for 6 years. I had read it as strength. It was strength, but it was also the thing that made sustained concealment possible for someone else. You can't compartmentalize professionally and then leave that skill at the office. It comes home with you. I should have understood that earlier. I should have asked, somewhere in those months, why she never seemed rattled. Ray came by Sunday evening unannounced, the kind of thing he did when he had decided a situation required presence rather than phone calls. He brought a six-pack and asked no questions, and we sat on the front porch I never used and watched the street go quiet in the way that residential streets in Indiana go quiet on Sunday evenings, gradually and completely. He told me, after a while, that his first marriage had ended in circumstances that had some similarity to mine. He said this not as comparison but as orientation, locating himself in the landscape of the conversation, so I understood he wasn't speaking from the outside. He said the hardest part had not been the divorce but the period before it, when the decision had been made but not acknowledged, when he'd been living inside a marriage that had already ended while everyone was still going through the motions. The acknowledgement, he said, was actually a relief. Even though it was also terrible. I thought about that for a long time after he left. The red herring arrived Monday morning, which was the last day before Melissa returned. Phoebe called to say she'd been looking into Connor, not intrusively, she said, just publicly available information, the way you look into someone when you're trying to understand a situation. What she'd found was unexpected. Connor's landscaping business had filed for bankruptcy protection 6 months ago. He was, by all available public indicators, in significant financial difficulty. I sat with that information and turned it over. Was the affair about something other than I'd assumed? Was Melissa providing financial support, or was Connor seeking it, or was the financial situation simply background context that didn't change the emotional facts? I concluded that it didn't change the essential picture, but it added a dimension I hadn't anticipated. It meant Connor was not simply an ex-boyfriend but a man in crisis, which made the appeal different, and possibly more dangerous, than a rekindled romance between two people who had simply drifted back toward each other. It also made me wonder, for the first time, whether Melissa's expanded client work over the past year had been entirely about professional growth. I pulled up our joint banking app that evening and spent an hour going through the transaction history for the past 12 months. What I found was not dramatic, no single large transfer, no obvious redirected funds. What I found was a pattern of cash withdrawals, regular and moderate in size, that had begun in May and continued through September. Each one individually unremarkable. Together, over 5 months, they added to a number that was not trivial. I documented what I found. I called Patricia, a family attorney in Columbus that Ray had mentioned in passing once, years ago, as someone he would recommend if he ever needed to, and left a message. I went to bed before Melissa came home on Monday night. I heard her key in the lock at 11:40. I heard her move through the downstairs. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, careful and quiet. She came into the bedroom and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me in the dark. I was awake but still. She couldn't tell whether I was sleeping. She went to the bathroom. I heard water running. She came back and got into the bed with the careful movements of someone trying not to disturb a sleeping person. I lay in the dark and said nothing. And in the morning, when she came downstairs to find me already at the kitchen table with coffee and a folder I had prepared, the conversation that followed was the one I had been composing in my head for 72 hours. She saw the folder first. Melissa had the instinct of someone whose professional life required rapid situation assessment. She read environments the way other people read faces, picking up information from arrangement and context before a word was spoken. The folder on the table, the coffee at my elbow, the fact that I was sitting and waiting rather than standing and making breakfast, she read all of it in the 2 seconds it took her to come through the kitchen doorway, and I watched the reading happen behind her eyes. She sat down across from me. She didn't reach for coffee. She put her hands flat on the table. "How long have you known?" she said. The question surprised me, not its content but its directness. I had expected denial, or deflection, or some version of the managed composure I'd been watching for months. What I got was a woman who had apparently decided, sometime in the past 72 hours, that the performance was over. "Long enough," I said. "The question I have isn't about Connor." She waited. I opened the folder. The banking records were on top, the 5 months of cash withdrawals, highlighted in sequence. I slid it across the table and watched her look at it. Something crossed her face that I hadn't expected. Not guilt, something more complicated. Almost relief, and then immediately something harder. "That's not what you think," she said. "Tell me what it is." A pause. Long enough that I could hear the house around us, the refrigerator's hum, a car passing on the street outside, Dara's alarm going off faintly upstairs. "Connor's business was failing," she said. "He called me in April. We hadn't spoken in years and he called because he was in trouble, Owen. Real trouble. He was about to lose everything." I looked at her. "I gave him money," she said. "Not because of, it wasn't romantic. Not at first. I gave him money because I knew him and he was desperate and I made a decision I knew you'd object to so I didn't tell you. And then?" She looked at the table. "And then I kept seeing him. To check in. And it became, I don't know how to describe it without it sounding like an excuse." "I'm not asking for an excuse," I said. "I'm asking for what's true." She was quiet for a moment. "Something happened between us. I didn't plan it. I know that doesn't matter, I know the planning is beside the point. But I need you to understand that it started as something else." That was the moment the story I'd been assembling for 72 hours shifted. Not the betrayal was real and unchanged. But the shape of it was different than I'd understood. She hadn't gone looking for Connor. Connor had come looking for her, in the specific and effective way that a person in crisis reaches towards someone they know will respond. And Melissa, whose professional identity was built around solving complicated problems for people who needed her, had responded. That's not absolution. But it's a fuller picture. "The overnight bag," I said. "On Thursday. You packed it before the argument." She looked up. "Yes. You were going to go regardless." "I needed to tell him it was over," she said. "I needed to do it in person. The argument was," she stopped. "I'm not going to say the argument was convenient. But yes. I was going to go." "And did you? Tell him it was over?" "Yes." She said it without drama. "That's why I was there for 2 nights. It wasn't what you probably imagined. He didn't take it well. I stayed because I didn't think I should leave while he was." She stopped again. "I made a lot of bad decisions. That was the last one." I sat with everything she had said. The kitchen light had changed while we talked, the October morning moving from gray to something warmer, and the house had the specific quality of a space where something significant had just been said and not yet absorbed. "The money," I said. "How much total?" She told me. It was more than the banking records showed, which meant some of it had come from sources I hadn't yet found. I added that to the folder in my mind. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said. She nodded. She had been expecting that. "I know. I saw Patricia Osei's name on the caller ID on your phone. I recognized it." Of course she had. Melissa noticed things. It was one of the qualities I had loved about her. "I'm not going to fight you," she said. "On anything. I know what I did and I know what it cost. She paused. "I need you to know that the marriage wasn't nothing to me. Even when I was making choices that treated it as nothing." Dara came downstairs then, quiet, alert, taking in the kitchen with the rapid perceptiveness of someone who had been expecting this morning. She looked at her stepmother and then at me and then made a deliberate choice to pour herself cereal and sit at the counter with her back to both of us, giving us the privacy of her presence without the intrusion of her attention. It was, I thought, the most graceful thing I'd seen in weeks. The divorce was straightforward, legally, aided by Melissa's decision not to contest anything and by Patricia's efficient handling of what turned out to be a moderately complex financial picture. The cash withdrawals, the additional sources I hadn't initially found, the question of what constituted marital assets versus Melissa's independent funds, these required more untangling than either of us had anticipated, but they resolved without litigation. Connor's business filed for final dissolution in November. Melissa's money, along with whatever else he had borrowed or received, had not been sufficient to save it. I learned this from Phoebe, who had continued her quiet research with the focused tenacity of a sister who had decided to be useful. I didn't feel satisfaction at the information. I felt, mostly, that it completed a picture that had taken months to assemble and was now finished. Melissa moved into an apartment in Cedarbrook rather than leaving town, which I had not expected and which was, on reflection, the right decision. Dara needed access to both of us, and Melissa's presence in the same city made that logistically possible and emotionally less dislocating. They had dinner together once a month, Dara's initiative, which told me more about my daughter's character than I had words for. Ray and I worked through the late autumn on the Millhaven Bridge assessment, which turned out to have a significant load distribution problem that had been developing for years and was invisible until you looked at the entire system from the right angle. We fixed it methodically, one component at a time, over 3 months. The work was satisfying in the way that structural work is always satisfying: problems with definite solutions, progress that was measurable, results that held. Phoebe came for Thanksgiving. She and Dara made a pie from scratch that required 4 attempts and produced, on the 4th, something genuinely excellent. I ate 2 pieces and watched them argue amicably about the merits of different pie crusts and thought about what reconstituted itself in a house after a loss: not the same thing, never exactly the same, but something with its own integrity. The unexpected twist in all of this was not Connor. Connor had been a vehicle, for Melissa's rescue impulse, for her loneliness, for the particular way that a person in crisis can illuminate the gaps in a life that looked complete from the outside. The real unexpected twist was what the whole experience revealed about the marriage itself. Melissa, in one of the final conversations we had before the divorce was finalized, said something that I've turned over many times since. She said that she had never told me about Connor's call in April because she had already understood, at that point, that I would respond to it rationally rather than emotionally, that I would assess the situation and advise against it and be correct, and that she had not wanted to be correct. She had wanted to respond to someone else's need in the way that need called for. What she was describing, I realized later, was a gap in our marriage that neither of us had named. I had been the person who assessed. She had been the person who managed. We had been, for 6 years, extraordinarily competent together and not always genuinely connected. The crisis of Connor had not created that gap. It had found it. That realization didn't change the decisions she made or the fact that I couldn't stay. But it gave the whole thing a dimension that pure betrayal narratives don't usually have. We had both contributed to the conditions. She had made the choices that ended it. I started running again in January, something I'd let go years ago when the demands of work and marriage had made it feel like an indulgence. The mornings were cold and the streets of Cedarbrook were quiet at 6 a.m. and there was something in the simple, repeating effort of it that I found clarifying. Not therapeutic in any self-conscious way. Just useful. Just mine. Dara turned 17 in February. We had dinner at her favorite restaurant, the 3 of us, Dara and Phoebe and me, and Phoebe gave a toast that was funny and exactly the right length and made Dara laugh until she had to put down her fork. I watched my daughter across the table, 17 and serious and capable of real joy, and understood something about what had been preserved through everything that had been lost. She caught me looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "I'm glad you're here." She rolled her eyes with the precision of a teenager who has been told this before and will never entirely stop needing to hear it. "Obviously," she said. What this story reveals at its core is the danger of functional competence as a substitute for genuine intimacy, and how that substitution can remain invisible for years precisely because it produces a life that looks, from every available external angle, like exactly what both people wanted. Owen and Melissa were not a failing marriage in the conventional sense for most of their 6 years together. They were effective. They managed a household, a blended family dynamic, demanding professional lives, and the ordinary difficulties of long cohabitation with what appeared to be stability. What they had stopped doing, and the story suggests this happened gradually, without a single identifiable moment of departure, was being genuinely known to each other. Melissa's decision not to tell Owen about Connor's call in April is the story's psychological hinge. She made the calculation, accurately, that Owen would respond rationally rather than emotionally, and she experienced that accuracy not as reassurance but as confirmation that certain parts of her were not available to him. The sadness in that detail is not about whether her assessment of Owen was fair. It probably was fair. The sadness is that she had apparently reached a point where being known accurately felt less important than being met fully, and she looked for the latter outside the marriage rather than inside it. Connor's financial crisis makes the story's moral landscape more complicated than a straightforward affair narrative. He did not seduce Melissa away from a healthy marriage. He arrived at a vulnerability, her rescue impulse, her loneliness, her need to respond to need in the way that need called for, and activated it. That doesn't reduce his moral agency or hers. But it changes the question from why did she do this to what was she looking for that she couldn't find at home, and the latter question has a more uncomfortable answer because it implicates the marriage rather than simply the person who left it. The cash withdrawals are the story's secondary revelation, the element that transforms the betrayal from emotional to also financial, and that demonstrates the accumulated cost of sustained concealment. 5 months of withdrawals, hidden in the routine noise of a busy household's finances, represent not just money transferred but a sustained willingness to deceive on multiple fronts simultaneously. The money went to Connor, yes. But the concealment of it went to the marriage, eroding the shared transparency that financial honesty in a partnership requires. Owen's response, patient, methodical, the 60-hour assembly of a complete picture before a single confrontation, is psychologically consistent with the man described throughout, someone whose professional gift is understanding load paths and failure points, who applies that same clarity to personal crisis. It is also, in a way the story acknowledges without laboring, a manifestation of the quality Melissa found insufficient, the rational response, competent and controlled, where the emotional response might have changed what was possible. What the story ultimately refuses is the comfort of a clean villain. Melissa made choices that ended a marriage and cost a man she had promised fidelity significant financial and emotional damage. Those choices belonged to her. But the marriage she made them inside was a real marriage with real gaps, and Owen's final reflection, we had both contributed to the conditions, is not self-blame. It is honesty. The two are different, and the difference matters. What sits with me most about this story is Dara. 16 years old, finding Connor's name on a phone she wasn't looking at, and then carrying that for 4 months alone, deciding, with the protective instinct of someone who loves a parent and doesn't know how to help, to say nothing and hope it resolved itself. That kind of love, quiet, costly, unseen, is the part of betrayal stories that rarely gets named. The affair didn't just happen between two adults. It moved through the whole house. It lived in Dara's silence for 4 months before it surfaced anywhere else. And when it was finally over, she was the one who made pasta and sat at the counter and gave her father the privacy of her presence. 17 years old at her birthday dinner, rolling her eyes at being told she was loved. Obviously, she said. Some things, at least, land the way they should.